I went to a stranger's house thinking I was safe. I was very wrong. This happened a few years ago, but the memory is still as clear as ever. I was in a bit of a rut at the time. Work wasn't great, and my social life had kind of fizzled out. It was one of those periods where everything felt stagnant and I needed something to shake things up. That's when I got into Tinder. I wasn't expecting anything serious, just a distraction, maybe even a way to meet someone new. I'd had a couple of casual dates here and there, nothing memorable, just the typical awkward first dates that led nowhere. Then I matched with this guy named John. He stood out right away because his profile didn't have the usual mirror selfies or gym shots. Instead, it was filled with gorgeous travel photography. Scenic landscapes, cityscapes, candid portraits of people in distant places. It all looked so genuine. He described himself as a travel photographer, which was exciting to me because I'd always wanted to travel more. The photos were beautiful, and his messages were thoughtful, not the usual one-liners I was used to. He seemed cultured, interesting, and, most importantly, normal. We started talking regularly, and I found myself getting more and more comfortable with him. We chatted for about a week before he brought up the idea of meeting. He mentioned that he had a small private studio where he displayed some of his work. It was in Chicago, where I live, and he said I should come by and check it out. Now looking back, this is where I should have seen the red flags. First, he was pretty vague about the details of the studio. He never really explained where it was, just that it was in a quiet part of town near Humboldt Park. Second, there was this odd moment when I asked if I could bring a friend along, and he sort of brushed it off, saying it would be better if I came alone to fully experience the work. But at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. I thought he was just one of those serious artist types. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. I mentioned it to a friend, just in case, though I downplayed it, saying I was heading to check out a photography studio and would be back in about an hour. In truth, I felt more excitement than nervousness. It seemed like an adventure, something out of the ordinary, a break from my usual routine. The day of the meetup, the weather was terrible. Chicago winters can be brutal, and this day was no exception. It was one of those gray, cold days where the wind cuts right through you, and everything feels damp. I almost canceled because of the weather, but I convinced myself to go. I figured I'd go see some cool photos and then head home. Simple. I took an Uber to the address he gave me. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. Just one of those quiet residential areas that could either be up and coming or slightly run down, depending on the block. When we pulled up to the house, I felt a twinge of doubt. It wasn't what I expected at all. I had imagined a loft or a studio space, but this was just a regular house. There wasn't any sign indicating it was a gallery or studio. No art hanging in the windows or anything like that. I messaged John to let him know I had arrived, and he responded immediately, saying the door was open and I should come in. That felt strange. Who leaves their door unlocked in Chicago? Still, I brushed off the uneasy feeling lingering in the back of my mind and made my way up to the house. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was how empty the house was. The front room had barely any furniture, just a couple of chairs and a small coffee table. No pictures, no art, nothing that suggested this was a place where someone lived, let alone worked. The air smelled musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in a long time. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The door creaked as it closed behind me, and suddenly I felt very alone. I called out for John, but there was no response. For a moment I considered leaving immediately, though I didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, I had come this far, and perhaps I was just over-analyzing the situation. Deciding to continue, I walked deeper into the house, searching for any hint of life or art. As I moved down the hallway, the floors groaned beneath my steps, and I realized there were no decorations or photographs. Nothing to suggest this was the workspace of an artist. The walls stood bare, and the air carried an unsettling stillness. At the end of the hall, there was a door that was slightly open. I assumed this must be where he was, maybe working in his studio. But when I pushed the door open, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a studio. It was a small, windowless room with nothing in it but a mattress on the floor. Scattered around the mattress were random objects. Some blankets, a roll of duct tape, a pair of gloves, and most disturbingly, a length of rope. I froze. My mind was racing, but my body felt like it was stuck in place. Everything about this was wrong. I needed to get out, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I slowly backed out of the room and turned toward the front of the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I reached the living room, I heard a noise behind me. The front door was now closed, and standing in front of it was John. He was taller than I expected, and something about the way he was standing, blocking the exit, made my heart race. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring at me. His expression was completely blank, and that scared me more than anything. There was no way around him. He was between me and the door. I tried to stay calm. I forced a smile and said something about needing to grab something from my car, hoping he'd move aside. But he didn't budge. His eyes followed me as I took a step toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew if I made any sudden movements, he might do something. I needed to get out, but I couldn't let him see that I was panicking. I took another step forward, and then, without thinking, I made a run for the door. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, slamming it behind me as I bolted down the steps and into the street. I didn't stop running until I was a few blocks away, gasping for breath. I didn't have my phone in my hand, so I couldn't call for help right away. I just kept running until I found a busy street with cars passing by. I finally flagged down a taxi and got in, shaking as I told the driver to take me home. When I got home, I was still in shock. I sat on my couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to block him on Tinder immediately. But when I opened the app, his profile was gone. Just like that. No trace of him anywhere. I couldn't find him online, no social media, no photography pages, nothing. It was as if he never existed. I reported the incident to Tinder, but without any concrete evidence, I knew there wasn't much they could do. For the next few days, I was a wreck. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't left when I did. The house, the empty room, the rope. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. I told a few friends, but I downplayed how scared I really was. I felt so stupid for going there alone. How could I have been so naive? The thing that haunts me the most is that I'll never know what his intentions were. Was he just some creepy guy? Or was it something worse? I've run through every possible scenario in my head, but I'll never have an answer. I'm just grateful that I got out when I did. After that experience, I deleted Tinder and all the other dating apps. I couldn't trust myself to make good decisions anymore. Not after how easily I walked into such a dangerous situation. It took me a long time to feel comfortable dating again. And even now, I'm much more cautious. I don't meet people in private places, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am and who I'm with. I went on a Tinder date, and he wouldn't let me leave. This happened a little over a year ago, and honestly, I'm still kind of processing it. I've been on my fair share of weird Tinder dates before, but nothing has ever come close to this. I'm not sure if I'll ever feel completely comfortable dating again. Every time I think back on that night, I get chills because it could have gone so much worse than it did. I still feel uneasy sometimes, like this guy could be out there looking for someone else to trap in the same situation. At the time, I was living in a small apartment in Logan Square, Chicago. I had been using Tinder off and on for a few months, mostly out of boredom and, to be honest, loneliness. It's hard to meet people in a big city, especially if you're not into the bar or club scene, which I'm definitely not. So Tinder was my go-to when I wanted some interaction without too much effort. Most of the matches were unremarkable, some awkward conversations that led to nowhere. The occasional meetup that fizzled out after one date. Nothing serious. Then I matched with this guy named Ben. At first, he seemed normal enough. His profile was pretty standard, some decent photos, a couple of basic lines about his job and his love for the outdoors. We chatted for about a week before he suggested meeting up in person. We talked a lot during that time, and I started to feel like maybe this could be a good match. He seemed laid back, kind of quiet, but thoughtful in the way he responded to my messages. He wasn't pushing for anything, and that put me at ease. He didn't bombard me with messages or come off as overly eager, which was refreshing compared to a lot of other guys on Tinder. We agreed to meet at this low-key bar not too far from my place. It was the kind of spot where you could actually have a conversation without yelling over loud music or crowds, and I appreciated that. I was looking for something casual, so a bar setting seemed perfect. I didn't expect the night to be anything special, just a couple of drinks, maybe some light flirting, and then we'd both head home. Simple, right? The night of the date, everything seemed fine. I met him at the bar, and he looked just like his pictures. That was a relief because I've definitely had those awkward moments where someone looks nothing like their photos, and it's hard to hide the surprise. But Ben was exactly as he appeared online. Tall, clean-cut, kind of preppy in a way, but not over the top. He wasn't super talkative at first, which I chalked up to nerves. I've been on enough dates to know that sometimes people just need a little time to warm up. We ordered a couple of drinks and started chatting. The conversation was a little stilted at first, but after a while, we found some common ground, talking about movies, work, the usual small talk. I wouldn't say there was an instant spark, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. I figured it was just a first date thing. Sometimes it takes a while to click with someone, and I didn't mind giving it a chance to see where things went. After about an hour, though, I noticed that Ben started to get a little pushy. Not in an aggressive way, but he kept suggesting that we should leave the bar and go back to his place. He kept saying it was just a few blocks away and that we could continue the night there, maybe watch a movie or something. I politely declined, saying I wasn't ready to go to someone's place on the first date. I like to keep things light in public until I feel more comfortable with someone, but Ben wouldn't let it go. He kept bringing it up, trying to convince me that it was no big deal. He said that it's just right down the street, and that we don't have to do anything. We can just hang out. I started feeling uneasy at that point. His persistence was a red flag, and it felt like he was testing my boundaries. I kept saying no, and while he wasn't outwardly angry, there was this undercurrent of frustration in the way he kept pushing. He'd smile, but his eyes looked sharp, like he was sizing me up. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, hoping he'd drop it and we could just finish the date without any weirdness. But it was clear that he had no intention of letting me leave on my own terms. When I mentioned that I should probably head home soon because it was getting late, he suddenly got very insistent about walking me to my apartment. He kept saying he wanted to make sure I got home safely. That set off alarm bells for me. I didn't want him knowing where I lived, especially after how pushy he'd been all night. At that point, I was feeling pretty trapped. I didn't want to escalate the situation, but I also knew I needed to get out of there. I lied and said that I had to pick up a friend who was in town and that we had plans later that night. Ben didn't seem happy with that excuse, but he didn't argue right away. He just stared at me for a moment before saying that he'll wait with me until my friend arrives. That made my skin crawl. I felt like I had no control over the situation. I wanted to leave, but every time I tried to make an excuse, he found a way to corner me into staying. I ordered one last drink, hoping it would buy me some time to figure out how to get out of there. I was starting to panic, but I didn't want him to see that. When the drink came, I pretended to get a text from my friend, acting like they were nearby and needed me to pick them up right away. I told Ben I had to leave immediately, and this time I didn't give him a chance to argue. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. But Ben was right behind me. He didn't even give me a second to put space between us. He walked with me out of the bar, insisting that he could walk me to the car or help with my friend. Outside, it was cold and dark. The streets were pretty empty because it was a weeknight, and that only made things feel more ominous. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber, praying that it would show up fast. Ben was standing too close to me, his body language making it clear that he wasn't going to let me leave on my own. I felt this tight knot in my chest, a mix of fear and frustration. I wasn't used to being in situations like this. I usually know how to handle myself, but something about the way he hovered around me, that persistent, calm pressure, made it hard to think straight. When the Uber finally pulled up, I moved quickly toward the car, but Ben followed right alongside me. He acted like he was getting into the car with me, opening the passenger side door as if he was just going to come along for the ride. I panicked and locked the door as fast as I could, telling the driver to leave right away. Ben stood there on the sidewalk, staring as the car pulled away. He didn't wave, didn't say anything, just stood there watching the car drive off. The whole ride home, I couldn't shake how surreal it all felt. It was like I'd been holding my breath the entire time, and now that I was in the car, the adrenaline started to hit. I felt shaky and nauseous, like I'd barely escaped something dangerous. I didn't realize how scared I'd been until I was safely away from him. When I got home, I locked all the doors and tried to brush off the uneasy feeling. But it didn't end there. The next day, messages from Ben started coming in. At first they seemed harmless. Things like him saying he had a great time and suggesting we hang out again soon. I ignored them, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, the messages became more frequent and intense. He started asking where I was, what I was doing, and why I wasn't responding. I blocked his number, thinking that would be the end of it. But then he showed up outside my apartment. I live on a pretty busy street, so I usually feel safe coming and going. But the first time I saw him standing across the street from my building, I felt a wave of panic. He didn't come to the door or anything, just stood there staring up at my windows. I stayed inside, watching him from behind the curtains, hoping he'd leave. After about an hour, he finally did, and I thought maybe that was the last I'd see of him. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, he showed up again and again, always lurking across the street, sometimes pacing back and forth, sometimes just standing there. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in my own apartment, constantly checking the windows to see if he was there. It got to the point where I was afraid to leave the house because I didn't want to run into him. One night, I came home late from work, and as I was unlocking the door to my building, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing a few feet away. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with this intense, unsettling gaze. I felt frozen for a second, like my brain couldn't process what was happening. Then I bolted inside, locking the door behind me as fast as I could. That night I called my landlord and told him everything. He helped me change the locks the next day, and I made sure to keep my curtains closed all the time. After that, I stopped seeing Ben outside, but it took me a long time to feel safe again. Even now, I still get nervous when I see someone who looks like him, wondering if he's still out there, waiting for another chance. Got lured into a trap on a Tinder date last year and barely got away. I still can't wrap my head around what almost happened to me. I'm just glad I trusted my gut, or I might not be here to type this. I'm posting this because maybe it'll help someone else avoid a similar situation. This happened last year, early summer. I had just moved to Chicago a few months before, and I was still trying to get to know the city. Chicago has always been on my bucket list. I've seen it in movies, heard people rave about it, and the idea of being in a big city where everything is close and exciting seemed perfect. I had rented an apartment in the Wicker Park area, close to everything. Coffee shops, dive bars, record stores, and that sort of artsy crowd I loved. It was the kind of neighborhood where I could walk around comfortably during the day, and at night, the streets felt alive but not too overwhelming. So, one weekend, after spending a few days working remotely and mostly being indoors, I decided to fire up Tinder again. I had deleted it a few months before because I got tired of all the dead-end conversations and awkward meetups that went nowhere. But now, with a new city to explore, I thought, why not give it another go? There's something about being in a new place that makes you more open to meeting people, even strangers. After a few mindless swipes, I matched with this guy, Tom. I know. Tom isn't the most exciting name, but his profile seemed legit. He had a few photos of himself hiking, hanging out with friends, and one where he was working on his laptop at a trendy coffee shop. He wasn't overly handsome, but there was something approachable about him, like the kind of guy you'd run into at a bookstore and strike up a casual conversation with about the book you're both reaching for. His bio said something like Chicago transplant, tech nerd, music junkie trying to make the most of the city one coffee shop at a time. It wasn't cringy or trying too hard, which was rare on Tinder, so I thought he might be a good option. We matched and started talking pretty quickly. The conversation was light and easy. Nothing overly flirty. Just two people getting to know each other. Tom seemed different from other guys I'd matched with before. He wasn't in a rush to meet up, which I appreciated. We spent the next couple of weeks messaging back and forth. He'd send me recommendations for places to check out in Chicago, hidden speakeasies, live music venues, even the best spots to get deep dish pizza without it being a tourist trap. It felt like we were vibing, and I was starting to think meeting up wouldn't be so bad. I had been on a few Tinder dates since moving to the city, and while none of them were horror stories, they also weren't anything to write home about. But with Tom, it seemed like we had real potential to at least have a decent time together. I liked that he wasn't pushy or trying to move too fast. I even joked with him once that he was one of the few people I matched with who hadn't made the conversation weird in the first 5 minutes. He laughed it off, saying he was taking his time, not trying to rush things. So, after about a month of texting, he finally suggested that we meet up in person. He recommended this small coffee shop in Wicker Park, one that I had actually walked past a few times but hadn't checked out yet. The place had good reviews online, and it was in a well-populated area, which made me feel comfortable. There's always this underlying fear when meeting someone from an app but I figured meeting at a public spot in broad daylight should be fine. We agreed to meet on a Saturday afternoon around 2 p.m. The weather was perfect that day, sunny but not too hot, with a slight breeze that made walking around the city feel refreshing. I remember feeling excited but also a bit nervous, the kind of nerves that come with meeting someone new. I threw on a casual but cute outfit, something that made me feel confident but comfortable, and headed out. The coffee shop was only about a 15-minute walk from my apartment. I got there right on time and decided to wait outside for a bit, just to take in the atmosphere. The area was bustling with people, groups of friends and couples walking by, and I felt safe being surrounded by so much activity. After about 5 minutes of waiting, I didn't see anyone that matched Tom's photos, so I figured maybe he was running late. I walked inside and ordered myself a latte, found a cozy little table near the back where I could see the entrance, and settled in to wait. I glanced at my phone, still no message from Tom. I wasn't too worried yet. People run late, it happens. I sipped my coffee, scrolled through Instagram for a bit, and kept an eye on the door. About 10 minutes went by, and 2 guys walked in. One of them, wearing a hoodie, made eye contact with me as soon as they stepped inside. He smiled and walked right over to my table. At first, I thought maybe I had mistaken him for someone else, but he walked straight up to me like he knew who I was. He asked if I was meeting someone named Tom. My brain was trying to process what was happening. I hadn't told anyone at the coffee shop who I was meeting, so how did he know? I hesitated for a moment but nodded. And that's when he told me Tom was running late and had sent him and his friend to come get me. Immediately, alarm bells started going off in my head. This wasn't right. Why would Tom send 2 random guys to meet me? It didn't make sense. I tried to keep my cool, though, and just politely said that I'd wait here for Tom to show up. The guy in the hoodie smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. He insisted that we should all just go to a bar nearby, saying Tom was already there and it'd be more fun than waiting in the coffee shop. I declined, trying to stay calm, but my gut was screaming at me that something was very wrong. His friend, who had been standing quietly behind him the whole time, stepped forward now and mumbled something under his breath. But I couldn't catch what he said. He didn't seem as friendly as the guy in the hoodie, and the whole vibe shifted from mildly weird to full-on creepy in a matter of seconds. I stood up and said I needed to use the restroom, hoping that it would give me a moment to think and figure out how to get out of there. As I walked away, I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move. Once inside the restroom, I locked the door and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking as I texted my friend Jenny, telling her what was going on. I typed out everything as quickly as I could. The guys, the weird interaction, how I didn't feel safe. She called me immediately and told me to leave right away, that she was coming to pick me up. I agreed, but part of me still felt like maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Tom really was just running late and these guys were just being helpful, albeit in a strange way. But deep down, I knew something was off. When I stepped out of the restroom, the 2 guys were still standing by the door, waiting. They looked annoyed now, like they were growing impatient with me. I didn't make eye contact with them as I walked past, heading straight for the door. I could feel their eyes burning into the back of my head, but I kept my pace steady, not wanting to draw too much attention to myself. As soon as I was outside, I made a beeline for the street. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were still shaking. I scanned the street for any sign of Jenny's car, but she wasn't there yet. I kept walking, not stopping, hoping those guys wouldn't follow me. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw them. They had stepped outside the coffee shop and were standing on the sidewalk watching me. I met a man who lied about his identity on Tinder, and it turned into a terrifying experience. This happened to me a few months ago, and it still freaks me out whenever I think about it. I've never been the type of person to scare easily, but after what happened, I've definitely started questioning who I can trust, especially when it comes to online dating. I want to share this story because maybe it'll make someone else think twice before they meet up with someone they met on a dating app. I live in Seattle, and like a lot of people my age, I've been using Tinder off and on for a few years now. It's never been something I took too seriously. Most of the dates I've gone on have been casual. Sometimes they turn into something more, but usually it's just grabbing a drink and seeing where the night goes. Nothing too intense. I always make sure to meet in public places, let a friend know where I'm going, and take other basic safety precautions. I know dating apps can attract some sketchy people, but for the most part, I haven't had any major issues. That changed a few months ago. I had just ended a long-term relationship and decided to start using Tinder again. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to hang out with and take my mind off things. After a few days of swiping, I matched with this guy named Daniel. He was good-looking, mid-30s, and his profile seemed normal. He had a few pictures of himself at the gym, hiking, and one in front of what looked like a nice car. His bio mentioned that he worked in finance and that he was into fitness and the outdoors. Honestly, he seemed a little out of my league. But we started chatting, and he was surprisingly down to earth. There was nothing in our conversation that set off any alarm bells. In fact, he seemed polite and respectful, which was refreshing compared to some of the messages I'd gotten from other guys on Tinder. We messaged back and forth for about a week before he suggested meeting up in person. He didn't push for anything too soon, which made me feel more comfortable about meeting him. He suggested we meet at a park downtown for a walk, which seemed like a nice low-pressure option. I had mentioned in our chats that I enjoyed being outdoors, and since it was summer in Seattle, the weather was perfect for a walk. Meeting in a public place also made me feel a lot safer. The day of the meetup, I got ready and texted a friend to let her know where I was going. I even shared my location with her just in case. I know that sounds paranoid, but it's something I always do when meeting someone for the first time, especially from a dating app. It's just a precaution I've gotten into the habit of. I got to the park a little early and found a bench to sit on while I waited. After a few minutes, I got a text from Daniel saying he was running late, but that he'd be there soon. That didn't bother me. People run late all the time, and I was just enjoying the nice weather while I waited. Then things started to get weird. A man walked up to me after I'd been sitting there for about 10 minutes. He didn't look anything like Daniel's pictures. He was older, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, and looked disheveled. His clothes were wrinkled, and he had a scruffy beard that didn't match the clean-shaven look Daniel had in his profile. He introduced himself and said he was Daniel, but immediately I knew something was off. This guy didn't look anything like the photos I'd been staring at for the past week. I was confused at first, thinking maybe he was joking or that this was some kind of prank. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't kidding. This was the guy who had been messaging me as Daniel the whole time. I tried to play it cool and asked him what was going on. He was calm but didn't seem at all apologetic. Instead, he told me that the photos he used weren't actually him. He said he'd been using someone else's pictures because women his age wouldn't respond to him otherwise. My mind was racing at this point. I was angry and uncomfortable, but I was also trying to figure out what to do next. It was broad daylight, and there were people walking around the park, so I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, but the whole situation was unsettling. I told him that I wasn't interested in hanging out anymore and stood up to leave. That's when he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. He didn't seem aggressive, but the way he positioned himself made it clear that he didn't want me to leave. He started talking about how he just wanted a chance, that I should give him a few minutes to explain, but I wasn't having any of it. I could feel the panic setting in as I realized that this was not going to be as easy as just walking away. He offered me money to stay and talk with him for a bit. At this point, alarm bells were going off in my head. He was blocking my path and trying to convince me to stick around with cash. My gut was screaming that this situation was not safe. I glanced around and saw that the number of people in the park had thinned out since I arrived, and no one seemed to be paying attention to us. I stayed calm, though. I didn't want to escalate things or make him feel like I was panicking. I told him I wasn't interested and that I needed to leave. I took a step back, hoping he would get the hint and let me go, but he didn't budge. He just kept talking, trying to convince me to stay. At this point, I was getting really freaked out. I didn't know what this guy's intentions were, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I started looking around for an exit. The park wasn't huge, but the way it was laid out made it easy to get cornered if someone was blocking the main path. I noticed a group of people walking nearby, so I decided to head toward them, hoping he wouldn't follow me. As I moved to the side, he tried to step in front of me again, but I dodged him and walked quickly toward the group of people. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was doing my best not to show that I was scared. The last thing I wanted was for him to see that I was freaked out and to escalate things. Luckily, he didn't follow me. I reached the group of people and slowed down, trying to blend in with them as I walked. I glanced back over my shoulder, and the guy was standing there, watching me. He didn't come after me, but the look on his face was chilling. He just stood there, staring, like he was waiting for me to change my mind and come back. I kept walking, trying to keep my cool, but inside I was panicking. I pulled out my phone and texted my friend, telling her what had just happened. She called me immediately and told me to get out of the park as fast as I could. I didn't need to be told twice. I walked toward the park exit, trying to stay as calm as possible while my heart raced. I finally made it out of the park and onto the street, where there were more people around. I felt a little safer, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the guy might be following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see him anywhere. I practically power walked all the way home, and the whole time I kept thinking about how close I had come to something much worse. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the more scared I became. What if he had followed me? What if I hadn't been able to get away? The fact that he had lied about his identity and tried to block my way when I wanted to leave made me realize how dangerous the situation could have been. After that, I deleted Tinder and haven't used it since. The experience shook me up, and I'm still wary about meeting people from dating apps. I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and got out of there when I did. If there's one thing I learned from this, it's that you can never be too careful when meeting someone from a dating app. No matter how normal they seem online, you never really know who you're dealing with until you meet them in person. My Tinder date's apartment had a locked room, and I should have left sooner. Last year, I went on a Tinder date that still haunts me to this day. It's been a while since it happened, but I can't stop thinking about how close I came to something much worse. I'm sharing this because I think it might help someone else avoid what I went through. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. but at the time I tried to brush off the weird vibes and second-guess my own instincts. So this happened in New York City. I'd moved here a couple of years ago for work, and after settling in, I started using Tinder on and off, like most people in their 20s. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to hang out with, maybe date casually. After a string of forgettable matches and first dates that never went anywhere, I matched with a guy named Nick. Nick seemed different right from the start. His profile wasn't like the others. He didn't have a bunch of shirtless pics, and his bio wasn't full of cheesy pickup lines or anything like that. Instead, it was simple. Just a guy who loves music, quiet nights, and good conversation. It was refreshing. His pictures showed him at concerts, a couple of candid shots at cafes, nothing too over the top. He had this laid-back vibe that made him seem trustworthy. We started chatting, and things clicked pretty fast. He was funny, but not in a way that felt forced. It was more like he knew how to hold a conversation without making it feel awkward. We talked about music a lot, which was a big deal for me, since I've always been into live shows. He mentioned a few obscure bands that I happened to like, and we swapped Spotify playlists. After a couple of weeks of talking, we agreed to meet in person. I was a bit hesitant at first, but he didn't push. He even said we could meet somewhere public. No pressure. We met for coffee on a Saturday afternoon. It was one of those early spring days where it's finally starting to get warmer, and the sun actually feels good on your skin after months of cold. We went to a little cafe in the East Village. The first meeting was chill. He was easy to talk to, just like he had been online. There were no awkward silences, and he didn't give off any of the creepy vibes I'd felt on other dates. He wasn't super talkative, more on the reserved side. But I took that as him just being introverted. We kept seeing each other after that. A few more casual dates followed. Coffee, dinner, walks in Central Park. Everything seemed fine. If anything, Nick was just a little quieter than most guys I'd dated before. He'd listen more than he'd talk, but it didn't seem like a big deal. He wasn't pushy, and he never made me feel uncomfortable. I liked that. I wasn't looking for something intense, so it seemed to be working out. After about a month of casually dating, he invited me to stay over at his place. Up until that point, we had always gone out in public, so I hadn't seen where he lived. He told me he had a small apartment in Brooklyn, in an area I wasn't super familiar with. I was a little nervous about it. Something about going to someone's place for the first time always feels like a step, you know? But I figured it had been long enough, and he hadn't done anything to make me question his intentions. The night we agreed on, I remember feeling a little anxious but also excited. He picked me up from my place, and we took the subway together to Brooklyn. His apartment was in a quieter neighborhood, which made me feel a bit more at ease. It was a typical Brooklyn walk-up building, nothing out of the ordinary. His place was on the second floor, and when we got there, the first thing I noticed was how sparse it was. I don't know what I was expecting, but his apartment was basically just the essentials: a couch, a small table, some bookshelves, and not much else. There weren't any personal touches like photos or decorations. It felt almost too bare, like it hadn't been lived in for long. But again, I brushed it off. Some people are just minimalist, right? The weirdness didn't really hit me until I noticed the locked door. His apartment was small, just a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and one bedroom, or so I thought. But there was this one door off the hallway that was locked. At first I didn't think much of it, but when I casually asked him what was behind the door, he just shrugged and said it was storage. I didn't push for details. I mean, everyone has stuff they want to keep out of the way, right? But still, it felt off. The door was padlocked, not just locked with a key, which seemed strange for a storage room. I made a mental note of it, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or rude by asking more questions. That night, everything seemed normal at first. We ordered takeout, watched a movie, and drank a little wine. I was trying to relax, but that locked door kept nagging at the back of my mind. I kept wondering what he could possibly be storing in there that needed a padlock. At one point, while he was in the kitchen grabbing more wine, I found myself glancing toward it. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. We went to bed around midnight. His bedroom was just as bare as the rest of the apartment. A mattress on the floor, a dresser with barely anything on it, and a small lamp. I figured maybe he just wasn't big on decorating, or maybe he hadn't been living there long. I tried to push the unease out of my mind and focus on falling asleep. I woke up around 3 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. It was still dark, and everything was quiet. But then, I noticed something. The door to the bedroom, which we had closed before going to sleep, was slightly ajar. I could see the faintest sliver of light from the hallway outside. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a draft, or maybe the door hadn't been fully closed, but that didn't stop the panic from creeping in. I lay there for a few minutes trying to calm myself down, but my mind kept going back to that locked door. What if someone else was in the apartment? What if the reason the door was padlocked wasn't because of storage, but something much worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I told myself I was being irrational. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed into the hallway. I glanced toward the locked door, and to my horror, it wasn't closed anymore. The padlock was undone, hanging loosely on the latch. My throat went dry, and I froze, standing there in the dark, staring at the door. The room beyond was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything inside. My mind started racing, wondering if Nick had gone into the room while I was asleep, or if there was someone else in the apartment. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps or movement, but the silence only made it worse. I turned back toward the bedroom, thinking I needed to wake Nick up. But when I stepped back inside, I realized he wasn't in bed anymore. My heart dropped. The bed was empty. My mind went into overdrive. Where the hell was he? I hadn't heard him get up. That's when I noticed something on the floor by the edge of the bed. Clothes. Not just any clothes, but women's clothes. Dresses, skirts, shoes, none of which belonged to me. I hadn't noticed them before, but now that I was standing there in the dim light, they were impossible to miss. A wave of nausea hit me, and I could feel my legs start to shake. I wanted to scream, but I knew I had to stay calm. My phone was on the nightstand, but I didn't want to risk making any noise. I backed out of the bedroom, my eyes darting between the open door to the locked room and the empty bed. I needed to get out of there, and fast. I crept down the hallway, trying to make as little noise as possible, and grabbed my shoes from the living room. My purse was on the couch, and I snatched it up, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I headed for the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, but enough to stop me in my tracks. I didn't dare turn around. I stood there, frozen, my hand on the doorknob, praying that whoever was behind me wouldn't come any closer. After what felt like an eternity, I yanked the door open and bolted down the stairs, not looking back once. I ran down the street, not caring that I was still half-dressed, my shoes barely on my feet. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, out of breath and completely freaked out. I never went back. I blocked Nick on everything. Tinder, my phone, social media. A few days later, I drove by his building out of morbid curiosity. but I didn't see him. His apartment looked the same from the outside, but I didn't dare go back in. Whatever was behind that locked door, I didn't want to know. I went to a Tinder date's place, and his roommate made everything feel off. A few months ago, I went on a Tinder date that still makes me feel uneasy whenever I think about it. I've had my fair share of awkward first dates and strange encounters through dating apps, but this one was by far the most unsettling. I'm sharing this because I want others to be more cautious, even when everything seems fine at first. It was early summer in New York City, and I had just started using Tinder again after a long break. Dating apps have always been a bit of a hit-or-miss experience for me, but this time I was feeling optimistic. After a few weeks of swiping and chatting, I matched with a guy named Evan. He seemed normal enough. His profile wasn't flashy or overly polished. He had a few pictures of himself in various places around the city, and his bio was short but straightforward. He worked in marketing, lived in Brooklyn, and was into photography and live music. He wasn't overly flirty or pushy in his messages, which was a nice change from some of the other guys I had been talking to. Our conversations were easy, and we talked about the usual stuff. Music, favorite spots in the city, and weekend plans. After about a week of messaging back and forth, Evan suggested we meet up for dinner. I wasn't too nervous about it. He seemed nice enough, and we had common interests, so I agreed. We decided to meet at a restaurant in Williamsburg, a trendy part of Brooklyn that I'm pretty familiar with. I felt comfortable meeting him in public, and Williamsburg is always busy, so I wasn't too worried. The dinner itself was fine. He was friendly, a little quiet, but I figured he was just one of those more introverted types. The conversation flowed well enough, and there weren't any major red flags. He was polite, asked a lot of questions about me, and seemed genuinely interested. There were a few awkward silences here and there, but nothing that really set off alarm bells. Overall, it felt like a typical first date, the kind where you're not sure yet if there's chemistry, but you're willing to see where it goes. After dinner, we walked around the neighborhood for a bit, and then he invited me back to his place. He lived nearby, and since the night had gone fine, I didn't see any reason to say no. I was still a little unsure about him, but I didn't feel unsafe or anything like that. It wasn't like we were heading to some isolated spot. We were still in Williamsburg, surrounded by people, and his apartment was just a few blocks away from the restaurant. When we got to his place, it was one of those older Brooklyn walk-ups. Nothing fancy, but not run down either. We went up a narrow staircase to the second floor, and he unlocked the door to his apartment. The first thing I noticed when we walked in was how empty it felt. The living room had a couch, a coffee table, and a TV. But there wasn't much else. No art on the walls, no photos, nothing that gave the place much of a personality. It felt oddly cold, almost like a temporary space. I brushed it off, figuring maybe he just wasn't the type to decorate or he hadn't lived there long. He offered me a drink, but I declined. I was already feeling a bit tired from the dinner, and I figured I wouldn't stay too long. He sat down on the couch and gestured for me to sit next to him. We talked for a bit more, but something felt different now that we were in his apartment. He wasn't talking as much as he had been at dinner, and there were more awkward pauses. It felt like he was waiting for something. I started to feel a bit uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was just first date jitters. After about 10 minutes, the door to one of the rooms down the hall opened, and a guy I hadn't seen before walked out. He was tall, a little older than Evan, maybe in his mid-30s, and had a quiet, almost distant expression. Evan introduced him as his roommate, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. The guy barely acknowledged me. He just gave a quick nod and mumbled something under his breath before heading into the kitchen. I didn't know what to make of it. The whole interaction was strange, but again, I brushed it off. Roommates are often weird, and maybe he was just the quiet type who didn't like interacting with his roommate's guests. Evan didn't seem fazed by the awkwardness, though, and he tried to keep the conversation going. But it wasn't long before the roommate came back into the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching us. Evan didn't say anything, and neither did I. It was one of those moments where the air in the room felt heavy, like something was off. But I didn't know what it was. After a few seconds, the roommate walked into the living room and sat down in a chair across from us, staring at me the whole time. I could feel his eyes on me, and I tried to keep the conversation with Evan going. But it was hard to ignore the tension in the room. After a few minutes, the roommate started asking me personal questions. They weren't the kind of questions you'd expect from someone who had just met you. He asked where I lived, if I had roommates, if my family was in the city, if anyone knew I was out that night. His tone wasn't friendly. And the way he asked the questions made me feel like he wasn't just making small talk. It felt more like he was gathering information. I tried to answer as vaguely as possible, but I could feel my anxiety rising. Evan didn't jump in or stop him. He just sat there, watching, almost like he was waiting for something. The whole vibe had shifted. I wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. I was starting to feel scared. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it felt wrong. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to make it obvious that I was panicking. I figured if I stayed calm, I could get out of there without causing a scene. I told him I was feeling tired and that I should probably head home. Evan didn't protest, but his roommate stood up and said he'd walk me out. I didn't want him anywhere near me, but I wasn't sure how to refuse without making things worse. He opened the door for me, and I quickly stepped out into the hallway, hoping he wouldn't follow me all the way to the street. As I walked down the stairs, I glanced back, and sure enough, he was following me. He didn't say anything, but I could hear his footsteps behind me the whole way down. When we reached the street, he stopped at the door and just stood there, watching me walk away. I kept my pace steady, but inside I was panicking. I didn't look back again until I was a few blocks away. When I finally felt safe enough to stop and breathe, I texted my friend to let her know what had happened. I told her everything, the weird vibe, the creepy roommate, the questions. I felt sick to my stomach thinking about how close I had come to something worse. The whole situation was wrong, and I kept replaying it in my head, trying to figure out what their deal was. It wasn't just the awkwardness or the weird questions. It was the feeling that I had been lured into something I didn't understand, and I had barely managed to get out. I never heard from Evan again. His profile disappeared from Tinder the next day, and when I tried to look him up on social media, there was no trace of him. It was like he didn't exist. I still don't know what was going on in that apartment, but I'm glad I trusted my instincts and left when I did. I haven't been on Tinder since that night. I can't shake the feeling that I was being set up for something, but I don't know what. I keep thinking about the way his roommate asked those questions, like he was trying to figure out how much of a risk I was. The whole thing still haunts me. I've always been cautious when it comes to dating apps, but this experience took things to a whole new level. Looking back, there were probably a few subtle warning signs that I missed. The fact that Evan didn't have much of a presence online, the emptiness of his apartment, the way he let his roommate take over the conversation, it all feels like it was part of a larger plan. I can't say for sure what was going on that night, but I do know one thing. I'm never putting myself in that kind of situation again. If you're meeting someone from a dating app, please be careful. Trust your gut and don't ignore the red flags, no matter how small they seem. What happened to me could have easily escalated into something much worse.